All right, thanks everybody for being here to this tutorial session. My name is Ted Pavlik. I'm from Arizona State University here local in town. So welcome to Phoenix. Hope you enjoy our weather here. It's a really good time of year to visit. And by the way, before I introduce Craig, I want to mention that so in your books, so you've got, of course, the paper version in your books and the electronic version. And sort of new this year, we're actually recording these. And so any of the kind of dynamic interactions that may occur during the tutorial session that those of you who aren't here don't have a chance to participate in, you can take part in that afterwards. And so if anybody you know was interested in being at this session but had to go to a different session instead, then please let them know that we actually have these recorded, and those will be available for them. So with that, I just want to mention, so I'm going to, right off the bat, I'm going to mention something so Craig actually got his PhD in 1981 with Danzig, and I mentioned that in 1981, that's an important year for me because it's the year I was born. Now, I bring that up not...
Oh, boy.
I bring that up
I
not...
I was that old.
Not because I want to emphasize Craig's age, but I want to say that, so in my laboratory at ASU, we do a lot of bio-inspired design, and Craig has been a role model for me throughout my entire career. So I thought it was actually... so when I noticed that his PhD was in 81, I thought, well, that actually sort of works really well. Because Craig is, what I like about what Craig does is he has enough of a passion for the nature to be willing to go out with a field biologist into the field and stare at honeybees for hours and gain insight and really marvel at their adaptation. However, he also has the sort of skeptical eye to be able to not get so caught up in it to immediately assume that there is something that could be obviously of interest to operations researchers in industrial practice. And he blends the two of those, a practicality and a passion, in a way in which that I think really should be a role model for anybody working in this area. So anyways, so sort of moving on. So Craig is, he's a professor at Georgia Tech. He's the H. Stewart Milton Fellow in the School of Industrial and Systems Engineering. He's got an MS in computer science and a PhD in operations research, both from Stanford University, and then as you'll see, he's got some background in biology as well. And in fact, he's the co-founder and the co-director of Georgia Tech's Center for Biologically Inspired Design, or CBID. So he has a lot of background in seeing these types of projects. So his research in biology and nature-inspired heuristics has been recognized by a Jacob Wolfowitz Prize and a Golden Goose Award, which you might have seen about. I think that happened pretty recently, if not last year, or maybe the year before that, 2 years ago. And he was the recipient of a Presidential Young Investor Award, a National Research Council Senior Associateship, and the ACM SIGICON Test of Time Award. His Erdős-Bacon number is 4. So with that, I want to, let's give Craig a welcome round of applause for his talk, his tutorial on nature-inspired heuristics.
All right, well, I don't think I'm going to be able to live up to that introduction. And I actually have to say that Ted is somebody I admire a great deal because he has this incredible mastery of the literature. Both, biology, optimization, applications. So I'm not so sure you should see me as a role model, but okay. All right, so.
Nothing on camera, right?
All right, so as Ted said, I'm one of the founders of the Center for Biologically Inspired Design at Georgia Tech. And the idea of bioinspiration is that living creatures are really good at doing some things because otherwise they'd have gone extinct. I mean, more than 99% of all species have gone extinct. So anything that's around now is really good at doing some things. And so if you observe them and figure out how they are doing what they're doing, that can lead to a good solution to a human design problem. Probably the most famous biologically inspired design is Velcro. Okay? So the inventor of Velcro took his dog for a walk. It was wet, and when he came back, he noticed that there were burrs sticking to his dog's fur, but it was wet. So it couldn't be glue. It had to be something else. So he put it under a microscope, and he saw, what you've seen in Velcro, those little hook-shaped sort of tendrils. And fortunately, nylon had been invented just a few years before, and so he was able to create a product that mimicked, the way the burrs stick to the dog's fur. The function biologically is propagation for the plant, because a plant can't move around and drop its seeds in many, many places to propagate. But if the burrs stick to a living animal, then, right? So you can see the evolutionary advantage from the plant's point of view. And, my son probably still doesn't know how to tie his shoes because he never has to, because it's all Velcro, right? By the way, the other, I think, really successful but horrible biologically inspired design that we all know also begins with a V, and that's the computer virus. Yeah. All right, so this talk is not about nature-inspired design in general, but about nature-inspired heuristics. And there's a lot of ground I want to cover. So I want to take a bit of time just to tell you what the main points are. So first off, instead of saying NIHs, because to me NIH means National Institute of Health, I call these NIAs, nature-inspired algorithms. So I'll be saying NIA a lot, even though the name of the tutorial is nature-inspired heuristics. So in general, NIAs are randomized, they're iterative, they're based on analogies from nature. They can be run for kind of as long as you want. So they offer, as many heuristics do, a trade-off between CPU time and solution quality. Most of them have a population of candidate solutions, and each iteration, they update that set. Okay? They don't have any optimality guarantees. Okay? There's no guarantee of even finite convergence for a discrete finite problem, because they have a lot of randomization. So they're not guaranteed to even eventually enumerate, in any finite time. And they don't offer any bounds on solution quality. Now, you shouldn't be feeling really impressed at this point. Okay? But the last point is really important. They are incredibly popular. All right, so there's two families of analogies. One is evolution, and the other is physical movement. And most nature-inspired algorithms derive from one or the other of these analogies. All right, so in the evolutionary analogy, your solutions compose a population, and the objective values, if you're maximizing, are the fitness of the members of the population, and more fitness, more offspring. So you get a set of offspring that favor the solutions that have better objective function value. Right? The physical movement analogy, you imagine you have a bunch of particles and they're moving around in an Rn, and the location of a particle at some time or some iteration count is a point in Rn, so that's your candidate solution. So your set of solutions at any time is the set of locations of these particles. And the particles can have velocity, not just location. And so according to their velocities and other things that you stick into the heuristic, they move around, and one time step later, they're in different locations. That's your new population. So these are really, really different metaphors. But the algorithms are really similar. And also, a lot of ideas have been traded between one group and the other. So although these seem like really, really different ideas, operationally they're very similar. I'll go ahead and say right away that I find the evolutionary metaphor a lot more compelling than the physical movement one, and you'll see why a little later. All right, so NIAs use standard ways of creating new solutions from all the solutions, mainly what we call neighborhood or local search. You have a solution, you make a small change to it, and if it's better, well, good, you've got an improvement. The novelty in these heuristics is that you've got a population. You're not working with one solution at a time, and they get information from each other. So in the case of particle movement, a particle will know where other particles are, and it will know the objective function values of the other particle. Okay? And if there's a particle that's got a much better objective function value, it'll steer that way. And in the case of the evolutionary-based algorithms, they do what I think is the biggest contribution of nature-inspired algorithms to optimization, and that is they bring sex in. Okay? Because you will take two solutions and you will take a part of one and a part of the other and combine them and get a new solution. Okay? And that's not something that traditionally we've done in optimization, but that's a core technique in nature-inspired heuristics. All right, so terminology. Okay, so this gets I don't know whether to say complicated or annoying. There are a lot of words for the same thing in this field. And there's, I think, an overdone desire to use metaphors when what they're doing is something that we would describe mathematically in a very simple way. So, the idea that you would favor a solution with a better objective function value, that's not a very deep idea for us. Okay, that's, but in genetic algorithms, that's, survival of the fittest. That's not all it's called. If you are looking for solutions nearby or similar to a good solution, well, that's exploitation. Sounds politically incorrect, doesn't it? And it's also called intensification because you're more intensely searching this area of the space. Okay? And one of the main problems with these algorithms is premature convergence, because if you have a good quality solution and you spend a lot of your effort looking in the neighborhood, then you'll be stuck maybe at a local optimum. You're certainly likely to miss out on high quality solutions that are in a totally different part of the space. So pretty much all of these algorithms also employ a counterbalancing principle, which they'll call diversification, which does sound politically correct, or exploration. And people like alliteration in rhyme, so you'll often see an algorithm described as having exploitation and exploration. Sounds good, right? Or intensification and diversification. So that's usually how those are paired up. Okay, and different researchers have slightly different definitions of these things, and some researchers will say that there's actually a very important distinction between diversification and exploration. And for this tutorial, I just can't get to that level of detail. All right, more on the main points. So most of the research in NIAs is insular. You read a paper written in this field, and they'll be comparing the performance of their heuristic with other nature-inspired heuristics. And they won't be comparing it with the stuff we in OR do. They seem to be blissfully unaware of what it is that we do. It's also true that a lot of their work is technically weak by our standards. And one of the excuses that they give is that their algorithms are general purpose. So it's okay not to compare them with the specialized algorithms that we have. But if you read their literature, you'll see that to solve a particular problem, you have to make a whole bunch of design decisions, and you have to do usually a huge amount of parameter tuning. So I'm not at all convinced that what they have is such a general purpose algorithm, but that's what you'll see claimed over and over again in their literature. So indeed, when they say solve, they usually just mean finding a solution. When they say we've optimized, they don't mean what we mean. They mean we found a solution that we think is probably good. Okay. Remember, there's no performance guarantees in these worlds. They don't see there's a difference between NP and co-NP. That is to say, they don't seem to see that there's a difference between finding an optimal solution and verifying that it's an optimal solution. And we all know that, for example, with integer programs, you usually spend 90% of your CPU time proving that the solution you found partway in is the optimal solution. Okay. And they'll be comparing runtimes, not up until the OR method found the optimal solution, but the whole runtime of the OR method. Okay. And their algorithms aren't even trying to prove optimality. And also, most of the NIAs around now don't scale up past about 100 variables. Okay. So you might wonder why the heck I'm even talking about this, because that doesn't seem like a very impressive topic, right? So one of the other main points that I want to make here is that NIAs have now surpassed operations research in number of publications per year, in the publicity, in their popularity in industry, and even among a lot of engineering communities. So that, I have to say, I was a little shocked to see when I started preparing this tutorial. But it's true. And that's a real important challenge for us in OR. We had better not ignore this, because it's swamping us. Okay. Okay. I gave a talk at the American Association for the Advancement of Science annual meeting earlier this year. And I showed how for problems like the minimum spanning tree, the shortest path problem, the traveling salesman problem, OR techniques are thousands to millions times better. And the audience was really surprised. They had no idea. These are first-rate scientists. I mean, AAS is not a lightweight organization, okay? And they didn't know. And we've really screwed up for that to be the case. All right. So I think the OR community has got to fully engage with NIAs. Invasive weed optimization is one of the zillions of nature-inspired heuristics out there. And you know, when I first encountered these, I thought they were nothing but little troublesome weeds. But they're supplanting us. That's not the only pun or joke I'm going to stick into this talk. Okay? And part of this really is our fault. And one of the problems, I think, is that we've gotten too taken away with the aesthetics of mathematics. Now, I love math. Yes, my Erdős number is 1, and I do work that's, you know, just pure math, and I love doing it. It's gorgeous stuff. But we in OR can't only do that kind of work, and we can't expect to continue to be important in the world of optimization if we only study problems for which there are nice, pretty mathematical results. Okay? This is our failing. Okay? And I was talking with a more practical-minded member of my department at Georgia Tech, and he said to me, look, people don't really care about the CPU time. They care about the time from when they realize there's a problem to the time that they have a satisfactory solution to the problem. And we really, you know, need to think about why it is that it takes our method so much longer to get to that point. And I think we've got to rethink the kinds of tools we offer to non-experts if we want to continue to thrive as a field. Yeah. Sure. Oh boy. So that's a question with long answers. The AI community has been using genetic algorithms since the mid-90s. And they figured out something that actually people in OR figured out first, but we seem to have not paid much attention to it, which is really the more powerful way to use genetic algorithms, which I'll come to later on in the tutorial. Well, another part of the answer to your question is that people now think of AI as neural nets, machine learning, you know, anything where you don't have to know a whole lot to use it. You just throw a bunch of data at an existing program and you get something out and you figure it's good. And in that sense, I think it'd be fair to say that nature-inspired heuristics are part of that, yeah. Another point I want to make is that when you understand what's happening in the natural world, and the lesson that you take from nature comes from a true understanding of the natural world. Your analogy is usually a lot closer between what's going on in the natural world and what you're trying to do, and most of the time, the analogy is more powerful. The algorithm that you derive from that analogy is a better algorithm. That's been my own experience, and looking through the literature, I think it's a generalization that holds up. So some of the lessons that we can learn from nature-inspired algorithms are to do a search not in the set of solutions, but to do a search in another space, a space of objects which produce solutions. The analogy in biology is that evolution occurs where? I mean, it's at the chromosome level, right? Okay. That's what biologists will call the genotype. There's slightly different definition exactly in biology, but it's fair enough to call it the genotype. But your DNA is a formula to create your body. Your body is the phenotype. And where does selection pressure occur? That occurs on the phenotype, right? So what nature's doing in evolution is it's doing its searching, okay, not on the bodies of the animals or the plants or right? It's doing the search in the space, in the genetic space, in the space of the chromosomes, right? But the way you measure the quality of a set of chromosomes is in the phenotype. You see? So you have an algorithm that produces a solution. Okay? You want to find a better solution? You don't alter the solution. You don't move around in that space. You move around in the space of algorithms. You change the algorithm a little bit. It's a much more powerful way, in many cases, to search for good quality solutions. Okay? I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but you can change one gene in Drosophila in a fruit fly, and you can get a leg turning into an antenna. That is to say, it'll grow a leg where it had been growing an antenna. Okay? Now, you can't modify the physical leg of the thing a little bit and get anything useful. Right? Okay? So you get one little change, and you go from one viable living organism to another one. Okay? And a lot of problems that we solve, there are solutions, and if you make a change to a solution in a difficult combinatorial problem, you make a little change to the solution, you'll be infeasible. Right? Okay. But if what you're doing is you're generating a solution using some algorithm that is built to generate something that's feasible, like a feasible schedule, right? Then, okay, you change the parameter weighting a little bit, and you'll get a different feasible solution. You see, it's so much better to move around in that space, okay? Because a little movement will take you to another feasible solution instead of just dropping you into a violated constraint. Okay, so anyway, that's a really important idea, and I think it's one that we should be making more use of. This idea of pooling information from different good solutions, this works, and we should make more use of it. In problems that aren't optimization problems such as decentralized control of robot fleets, there are plenty of species that work really, really well in groups, and we can imitate what they do and get better methods for controlling, as I said, groups of drones or other robots. Another thing that's nice about using a population is that when you're doing multi-objective optimization, instead of saying, all right, let's take the following set of weights for our 4 different objectives and try to optimize that particular weighted sum, and then taking a different set of weights and again trying to optimize with respect to that, and slowly generate points that are on or close to the Pareto frontier. If you're working with a population, you can generate a lot of points that are on or close to the Pareto frontier in one go. It can be much more efficient. Okay? And then last of all, for these, randomization with repetition is something that, it's like hill climbing with multiple starts. We've known this for, well, certainly since before I was born. Okay, but we don't use it nearly as much as we could. And now that so many CPUs are really multiple CPUs, okay, there's extra power in that, and a lot of our OR algorithms aren't making much use of that. All right, so let me go ahead and describe a bunch of different nature-inspired heuristics. All right, so I'm going to suppose our standard problem is to minimize a function f. And if it's a continuous optimization, it's just a vector in Rn. If it's discrete optimization, usually it's over the set of binary strings. In the NIA world, they don't do much optimization for continuous variables with complicated constraints. Okay. But they'll do stuff with simple box constraints or no constraints at all, because those are pretty easy to enforce. On the other hand, most discrete optimizations have a lot of structure, and the NIAs work with that structure. All right, so in genetic algorithms, they call variables genes, and they call a value that a variable takes an allele, and they call a solution a chromosome. But I'm just going to use the words, variables and solutions, because it's clearer that way. Okay, so I said before that they overuse metaphors, so I will take the liberty of reading one of the jokes I put into the tutorial. All right, so elitism is their term for keeping track of the best solution they found so far. And they couldn't just call it that, okay? They had to do it. So I wrote here in a footnote, and I don't know why Doug and Esmond let me get away with keeping this in, but they did. So I wrote, one of the peculiarities of the NII literature is a doggedness in seizing a metaphor in one's teeth and chewing on it to such a pulp that the reader can barely swallow it. So that's I think elitism is a good example of that. All right, so here we go. Populations. All right, so a population is a multi-set of solutions. Technically, it's not a subset of the possible solutions because you might have several copies of the same one. If something has a really good objective function value, then it might be represented more than once in your population. All right, and a lot of the algorithms, a fair number of the algorithms will also keep some ancillary data together with the solutions themselves. For example, in the particle movement heuristics, you don't just have a position, which is the solution itself, you have a velocity. So that would be part of the ancillary data. All right. So here's the structure that most NIAs follow. You choose an initial population, and if you need ancillary data, you choose that also. And the key concept here is population, right? Then you evaluate the function value of every member of your population. And this is something that is crucial to understanding what these algorithms are doing and what they're not doing. They treat the function as a black box. It's like an oracle call. Okay? That's not how we in operations research solve problems in general, right? Not at all. And you can see that there are inherent limitations to treating your function as a black box because, we're always using the actual structure of the function and the constraints to solve our problem. And in general, they're not. All right, then they'll have one or more stopping criteria. If you've met the stopping criterion, you stop. It could be iteration count, it could be a CPU time, it could be a number of iterations since you saw any improvement or since you saw more than a little bit of improvement. Okay. And then the key step is step 3. You build a new population Y, which is based on the current population X, maybe that ancillary data, and these function values. And there's always randomization involved in the way you choose that next population Y. All right? Then you set X to Y and you go back to step 1. So this is the structure that pretty much all of these algorithms have. You have a population, you see how the function values are, you build a new population out of the old one. All right. Okay. Again, if you're going to follow the particle movement metaphor, it's a set of new locations for the particles, but mathematically it's the same thing. All right, so what's involved in generating the new population? All right, so now to try to get all the ideas across in a fairly concise way, I'm going to make an algorithmically false separation. Okay, so I'm saying there's selection and there's generation. Selection is you have a bunch of possible solutions, which ones you decide that you're actually going to keep. Okay, and generation is you have a bunch of solutions. How do you generate a new set of solutions from it? And in the NIAs, these two things are mixed together. Okay? You might select a subset of X and generate new solutions from that set. So you've already done some selection before you do generation, and then you do some more selection. Yeah, so in the algorithms themselves, it's intertwined, but it's easier to get the ideas across by separating these conceptually. So, all right, how do you select? Well, the fitness idea is that's the intensification or exploitation or reinforcement. Okay, is you favor the solutions that have good objective values. And then the diversification idea is that you look for or you purposely generate or you favor solutions that are different from the solutions you've looked at before or different from the other members of the population. And then there's just sheer randomness. Okay. Oops, sorry. All right, so one of the ways of generating new solutions, completely familiar to us, calling it here perturbation. In genetic algorithms, they call it mutation, but it just means to make a small change to an existing solution. And again, it's always done in a randomized way. So you have a couple of parameters, and maybe with probability, epsilon 1, you generate, you decide that you're going to change the ith component of a vector, and then you generate a uniformly distributed variable with a parameter of epsilon 2, and you change that coordinate. Okay, so you need at least one parameter, and sometimes you need two to control this. Okay, and there is a nice idea that's come up relatively recently, which is to add an amount from a heavy-tailed distribution to an existing solution. This is for continuous optimization, not for binary strings. And the nice thing about that is that you'll make a large change in one or two of the coordinates, say. And so this kind of automatically gives you some of that diversification that you want to have. So that's something that's gotten pretty popular. All right, the main new idea, this is sex, is recombination. This is taking two solutions and taking some mixture of the two of them. And then there's a third idea, which has overlap, but I want to treat it as a separate, and I'll call that attraction. But let me show you the crossover, because this is one of the most important ideas in the whole field. So here are a couple of solutions, and you randomly choose an index, which is your crossover point. All right, so that's indicated here by the little vertical pink line. Oops. All right. Then you create two children, and you can see what they are, right? You take the prefix from one of the original members of the population, and then you take the suffix from the other one, and vice versa. Okay? This is the crossover operation. It's the mimicking of splitting of chromosomes and merging them, right? And this is used so often that people sometimes say that they'll use the word crossover to mean reproduction. Okay, so it's really, this is actually one specific way to do it, but it's so popular that often that word is used for all of the different methods. Okay, so here's some variations. You can have more than one crossover site, so that you use, oops, okay, use the first K1, values from one solution, then you take the next K2 values from the second solution, and then you go back to the first solution and use K3 values from the third solution. Okay, and you might mix them up that way. The idea of attraction is similar, but you do it when you have one solution X, another solution Y, where Y is better. Y has a significantly better objective value. And then what you do is you change X to be more like Y, but you don't touch Y. Okay. All right. So, you might randomly select a few indices and change the value xi to equal yi for those. Okay. All right. So another thing that you might choose to be attracted to isn't a particular solution, y, but rather your sort of consensus on what values have appeared many, many times in the good solutions you found so far. Okay? And this was invented by Lin of Bell Labs when he was doing 2-opting and 3-opting for the traveling salesman problem. And he found that when he did 3-opting from different starting points, there were a lot of edges that showed up in all or almost all of his local optima. So he said, okay, we're just going to fix these edges. We're just going to be sure to use these edges, and then we can do an optimization on a much smaller set of variables. Okay? And he called that consensus. All right? In the world of NIAs, that would be attraction. And it's not attraction, as I said, towards one solution. It's attraction towards what's historically been doing well. There's lots of ways you can make X more like Y. If it's in continuous optimization, you might take a convex combination of X and Y, so you're taking a point on the line segment between X and Y. You might change the velocity of X to steer towards Y. I guess the point I want to make here is that there's so many design decisions when you're creating these algorithms, and so many parameters to set, that yeah, they're general purpose, but it takes a lot of work to actually, implement it. All right, so another problem that you have in this in the area of selection is what's the meaning of one objective function value versus another? So I have, I'm minimizing. I have an objective function value for one solution of 50, and I've got another one, and its value is 40. Well, does that mean that the second solution is 5/4 better than the second one? I don't know. I mean, if the optimum is 40, it's a lot better than 5/4 better. If the optimum is negative 300, then the 40 is a heck of a lot better than the 50, right? But we don't know what the optimum is. Okay, and so you might decide to add an offset. Sometimes people just use the ordinal information. So they'll have a population, they want to pick the good members. They don't know what the absolute values of the function, objective function means, so they'll take the best 25% of the solutions. Or they'll want to randomize it, so they'll pick 10 solutions and randomly and choose the best of those 10 and do that repeatedly. Okay. That's called tournament selection, but to me it's just a way of implementing a choice based on ordinal information. All right, so a problem that comes up in pretty much all NIAs is this balance, finding a good balance between exploration and exploitation. And this is a little more complicated than I used to think. I thought it was just a matter of trying not to get stuck in a local optimum. Okay? So, you know, if all you're doing is exploitation, all you're doing is searching in a neighborhood of the good solution you found so far, oh, well, you're going to get trapped in the local optimum, right? You know, on the other hand, if you don't do any exploitation and you're just generating random solutions, well, that's an awfully slow way of trying to find a good solution. So you want some balance between the two. All right, so one way of describing or thinking of what this problem is that you prematurely converge to a solution that's not so good, like being stuck in a local optimum. Okay? But if you look into the biology, I think a closer analogy to what's happening and to what the real problem is algorithmically is drift. So in biology, if you are studying a population of a species that's isolated from most of the population, then the biologists often observe what's called genetic drift. And what does that mean? It means a couple things. It means first that there tends to be a lot less genetic diversity in that smaller population. And also, the distribution of genes is not typical of the population as a whole. You may have a gene that's quite common in the overall population, and that gene is completely absent, okay, in this smaller population. We call this genetic fixation. And if you're trying to take advantage of this idea of a population, then the worst thing you can have is a population where everybody's identical or almost identical. You've lost all the benefit of the whole of the idea of having a population instead of following one solution at a time. And it turns out it's pretty darn easy to implement a nature-inspired heuristic and get this genetic drift and end up with a population that's almost identical. Let's see.
So, Craig,
Yeah.
it's going to matter more when the heuristics are doing well. And you've made a case that an awful lot of these heuristics do poorly compared to anything the OR community develops for a wide range of problems. So where do these heuristics end up doing pretty well?
Let's see. Well, in the press,
Right, but that's not the original objective value, or it's not the original fitness function.
well, we wish it weren't. So when you do the genetic algorithm, and you use this idea that I brought up before of searching not in solution space, but in a parameter space, an algorithm space, then you can get very, very good solutions.
Has that been done much?
It's been done some. It hasn't been done nearly enough. I'll give an example of the first one I know of a little bit later. So I think that's one of the most promising things that people in OR should look at. And we really know very little about it. But so I'll go ahead and say it. So Bob Storer and a master's student of his did work in, I think, 1990, where they got better solutions to some job shop problems than the best known. You know, the shifting bottleneck heuristic, I think, was the most effective heuristic known at the time. And they beat it pretty royally using genetic algorithms. And then Jim Bean, 3-4 years later, kind of rediscovered the same thing. Okay, so those are the early examples I know of where, oh yeah, they did very well. Yeah. Wait. Say that again. I don't think I caught the question.
So would these algorithms, NIA algorithms, provide any computational time advantage over like branch and bounding for integer problems?
I see. So they could speed up branch and bound the way other heuristics do if they find a better feasible solution, right? That will speed up. I mean, that's what we do in integer programming all the time, right? We do a lot of heuristic search. So if we add this to the bag of heuristic tricks, then yeah, it will speed things up. I mean, some of these ideas already are present, right? So this idea of looking at a set of variables and freezing them, and then just doing optimization on the rest of them, which Lin originally discovered, but it's been used in NIAs more than in OR in many cases. But that's been implemented in CPlex since about 2003, I think. So I think the answer is, if we can find ways to if we can find ways to how to say this, to implement them in a way that really is generic, which the NIA community really hasn't succeeded in doing. But if we are able to do that, then we may very well speed up our branch and bounding, because we'll have a new set of heuristics which will, from time to time give us, better bounds. No, they can't be compared, because the NIAs don't do anything to find a guarantee of equality, nor do they have any promise of exhaustive search of the solution space. So, I mean, in the 1980s, there was a pretty big split between people who were doing heuristics and people who were doing integer programming. And what ended up happening was that the people doing branch and bound stuck heuristics, inside their algorithms, and they got good speed ups, and so they maintained this guarantee of eventually getting to the optimal solution and of getting bounds on the quality of the solution if they didn't terminate. So they kept those nice guarantees, and they solved some problems an awful lot faster. I mean, how the heck do you think we solved the big TSPs? I mean, we're using Lynn Kernighan all the time to find good quality solutions in our TSPs. Okay, so, I mean, I think that we're going to need to develop tools that have weaker guarantees than our branch and bound methods if we want to compete, in the real world. But that shouldn't stop us from improving our branch and bound algorithms either. Okay. All right. Anyway, I want to give a actual example of drift here. So suppose that for some sort of substring in the solution vector, there are two good sort of sets of values. In the tutorial, I gave an example like this where, these represent, say, matching in a subgraph. Okay. So what I'm saying is, let's suppose that a solution, we can just pretend these are the first 8 coordinates of the vector. Okay. A solution that doesn't have either one of these substrings in the first 8 positions is very unlikely to be a good quality solution. All right, so let's say we have an initial population where half the population's got this string and half the population has this string after we've done some selection, thrown out the values, the solutions that have bad values. All right, so then after we do crossover, okay, you're going to get a binomially distributed set of population members that have, this particular one and the complement here. Okay? But if you have a fraction q which is not equal to a half, it's a little more than half or a little less than a half, then, it's simple calculation, you'll get q squared over the sum of q squared and 1 minus q squared. And so what happens is, once q is away from 0.5, you get a drift that takes you further and further towards the extreme. Okay? And so even if it were just a random walk, then you would expect after order m squared iterations, one or the other of these strings would be gone. And because there's drift, it's going to happen even faster. All right? So, if you have a population of 10 or 20, it doesn't take very many iterations to have a portion of your solutions all looking exactly the same. Okay. All right. You can fight this off by having a larger population, but of course that slows down your algorithm. Okay. All right. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that it's not just a matter of being caught in the local optimum. It's this problem of losing the diversity in your population, which is one of the strengths of these algorithms in the first place. All right. So another reason I like the term drift to premature convergence is that to detect drift, technically, it just means you look at the population you have now. You don't have to know anything about history. Now, it's pretty trivial to prove that it's NP-hard. I gave a reduction in the tutorial. But at least calling it drift tells you that if you purposely work in some diversity, what they call it diversity maintenance, then you can deal with this problem. And so the main techniques for diversity maintenance are, first, just having a bigger population, the heavy tail perturbation I mentioned before for continuous variables, often just adding a few completely random new solutions to your population, weeding out solutions that are close to each other, just taking a subset of them. Okay. And another is keeping a set of solutions that are pretty distant from each other and that are at least pretty good.
So I'll
Yeah.
throw in one other while you're at it, which is having high-quality solutions prefer mating with high-quality solutions that are similar. So
Ah,
that, like,
yeah,
in
yeah.
human population, that the athletes might prefer mating with athletes.
Mm-hmm.
Great scholars might prefer mating with great scholars.
I think that's a really good idea, and I have not. Well, I mean, the literature, you spend your lifetime reading the papers that are already published, but I haven't seen that idea, and I think it's a really good one. Spiros. Nature, I mean, this just happens. Nature doesn't deal very well with that. I mean, the only thing that some evolutionary biologists believe is that that's how we get speciation. Okay, it's from these little fringe populations. It's a nice sounding theory, and Stephen Jay Gould was a big proponent of it, but I really don't think there's any actual evidence that it's true. It's just a way of dealing with the fact that the fossil record, is uniform for, millions of years and then has an abrupt change. And how are you going to explain the fact that you don't see any transitions? Well, you suppose, it was just a tiny little population that gave rise to the new species, and it was so small, the chance that we'd see any fossils from that little tiny population is small. I'm saying it's off the subject, but the mechanism that Jim mentioned, could deal with it, but nature doesn't deal with it. Yeah. Hey, there's no reason that we have to only imitate nature. We can do better. Hey, let's do better. All right, so let me describe 3 of the really basic NIAs. Simulated annealing, which I think most of you are already familiar with. That's based on the analogy that minimizing the free energy of a system, say of particles, is NP hard, but it seems that it happens pretty efficiently in the physical world. In particular, you heat something up, you cool it slowly, it's like a crystal, and you can get a very, very nice regular crystal, which has very low free energy. And so it's based on that metaphor. The genetic algorithm metaphor, I've already told you what that is. That's, evolution. The particle swarm metaphor, well, yeah, social insects are really good at doing things in groups, but they're not usually doing something that corresponds to optimizing a particular objective function value. So I don't think the PSO, the particle swarm optimization metaphor, is all that convincing, and I think that imitating the social insects is more likely to be helpful when you're trying to do distributed control than when you're trying to do, optimization. All right, so quickly, in simulated annealing, it's based on the Metropolis algorithm, which is a paper by Metropolis, Rosenbluth, Teller, and Teller, which is why I wrote S's there. And I think it was either Stan Ulam or von Neumann who really told Metropolis how to do this, by the way. But the basic idea is that, from physics, that the Boltzmann distribution tells you the probability that your system is going to be in state X. Okay, it'll be e to the negative energy level divided by kT. K is the Boltzmann constant and T is the temperature. So the Metropolis algorithm says you consider going to another nearby state. If it's lower energy, you just go there. If it's a high energy state, then you still go there, but with some positive probability. And the probability is given by, e to the negative delta, where delta is the absolute difference between the solution that you're at, x, and the possible new solution, y, which is worse. And that's scaled by temperature. So when the temperature's high, you're moving around pretty randomly, and when the temperature's low, this gets, magnified, and you're very unlikely to move to a higher energy state. And the cool thing about the Metropolis algorithm really is that you don't have to normalize. So you don't have to add up over all the states, all the F values, which would be a ridiculously hard thing to do. So that's really the breakthrough in the Metropolis algorithm. You will get the Boltzmann distribution without ever having to actually calculate what the constants were, without having to normalize. And the key reason this all works is because if you look at two different ways of getting from one state to another through increasing energy states, then the chance just depends on the difference between where you eventually get to and where you started, because, right, you're multiplying these probabilities, which is the same as adding these differences. Okay, and so there's a kind of path independence, and that's what really makes the Metropolis algorithm work. All right, so anyway, it's based on this analogy with annealing, where you heat and then slowly cool things. And so you run the Metropolis algorithm at a high temperature, you slowly lower it, sorry, and okay. And there was a great computational study by David Johnson, Aragon, and a couple other people, which gave terrific guidelines for how to set the parameters for simulated annealing. And it also showed some interesting properties of it, one of which, maybe the most important of one, which was that it's better to do one long run than to do a bunch of shorter runs. And unlike most other heuristics, the more time you give it, the better quality solution you get. It'll eventually beat just about any other heuristic if you give it enough time, but boy, does it take a lot of time. All right. Now, genetic algorithms, okay, you model your problem as maximizing your function because you're pretending that's the fitness. You generate an initial population, and then you set probabilities for each member of your population proportional to this fitness, although I said before you might have to do an offset to this for this to actually work. And then you draw two members from your population, favoring the members that have the better objective function values, and you draw these two samples, you do the crossover, that gives you the two progeny. Then you do some mutation on your new population, so you do some little random changes to it, and you repeat until you don't want to spend any more time. All right, so, okay. So the initial hopes for genetic algorithms were based on a theory of John Holland's that you would end up choosing alternatives in just the same way you would optimally choose how often to pull one lever versus another in a two-armed or multi-armed bandit problem. And Holland thought that by doing so, you could kind of simultaneously optimize over exponentially many different combinations of subsets of variables. And something similar to that was proposed by his PhD student Goldberg, who said that there are certain patterns in the solutions which are the building blocks of good solutions, and the genetic algorithm is going to identify a good building block here and a good building block there, and then when you do crossover, you'll get both good building blocks, and from that you'll generate a good solution. coding it, so, a couple hundred lines. It was hopefully going to be general purpose. They talked about this genotype-phenotype distinction, but if you read their papers and books, you'll find that what they meant when they talked about these two things is just what we call modeling, like a different integer programming model. So they missed the boat on the beauty of the genius of nature here. And they ended up deciding that the best way to encode a solution was as a binary string, which is actually not always true, but that's what they concluded. So that's what they hoped. When I first learned about genetic algorithms, I thought they were pretty garbagey. Okay? And why? Well, first, I didn't believe the schema theory of Holland's, because that would imply that P equals NP. Second of all, the first example Goldberg uses in his book, which is what really popularized genetic algorithms, was this problem right here. Look at this problem. Maximize Z, subject to Z less than or equal to 31. It took a while, and he didn't always get the optimal solution, but usually he got the optimal solution. Yeah. What? With hundreds of lines of code and a fair amount of CPU time, too. He expressed Z as a binary string of length 5, and he was able to get a solution. However, if you use his algorithm on the same problem for Z less than or equal to 32, it's actually quite easy to prove that you're very unlikely to get the optimal solution. I proved it in the tutorial.
It's a much harder problem.
You're right. Hey. So, I was not impressed with GAs when I first put them. And I want you to all pretend that you're reviewing a paper for a journal, okay? And the main results are that it gives you a new algorithm to solve a pipeline control problem. Now, this control problem was solved to optimality by a paper published 15 years ago using dynamic programming. It took a few seconds of CPU time. But this new method finds solutions that are within 2 or 3% of optimal. And it does it in just a few hours of CPU time. Okay? Now, okay, like how would you rate this paper? Would you recommend acceptance without any changes? Minor revision? What do you think?
Did you review this paper?
No, this is Goldberg's dissertation.
Oh. I have reviewed papers that are going way back that are similar to this.
Oh gosh. So this is Goldberg's dissertation. He makes a big show of this in his book. Okay, look, Danzig's linear programming extensions book has like 12,000 citations when I checked Google Scholar. Goldberg's book has something like 60,000. Okay, because it did so much better than the simplex method.
He didn't include the paragraph about the control problem being solvable.
Oh, he did. He actually mentioned it. How does he know he's within 2 or 3% of the optimal? It's only because he knows the optimal because it was found 15 years ago in a few seconds of CPU time. I mean, it's just unbelievable, isn't it? Okay. And yet, Holland writes an article in Scientific American that everybody thinks this is just great. Okay, so anyway, you can see why I didn't think much of GAs. Okay. On top of that, GAs were the first algorithm I ever saw that surpassed simulated annealing in CPU time requirements. Okay. And they require extensive tuning. There are a couple examples I give in the tutorial. One of them is this. A guy named Mikhailovich ran more than 1,000 trials on 5 test instances of the transportation problem. That was so that he could tune his genetic algorithm, and he could actually get optimal or near optimal solutions to 10 by 10 transportation problems. Okay? And it only required that much tuning. Isn't that amazing?
100 arcs.
Yeah, anyway. So, okay. But, oh, here's another thing. If you look at Google Scholar, you'll find 600, citations of papers that have a new or novel selection operator. Why would you have a new or novel one? Well, if it's a general purpose algorithm, well, it's because it didn't work well, so you had to invent a new one, right? How about mutation? Oh, well, there's 2,000 papers that invent new mutation operators for the particular problem they're trying to solve because the usual one didn't work. And there's 7,000 with new or novel crossovers. Okay, so, okay. But if you look at a 12-month period from mid-2017 to middle of this year, you'll find 11,300 Google Scholar results for genetic algorithms, which is more than the number for linear programming and integer programming combined. So do you see why I'm a little worried? There's this incredible gap. Yeah.
Why is this happening? Is it just the ignorance that the people don't know what the IPs or the IPs? Why is that?
Well, Ted said that people want less OR, not more. They want something simple and easy that doesn't require any expertise to use. And this fits the bill. And that's one answer to your question. I think another answer to your question is because we've really screwed up. Okay, let me keep going here. Actually, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over particle swarm optimization. Just say the gist of it is that the particles move around and you tend to get them to move towards either the best location that they've been in before, some combination of that, and the best solution that you have on hand. All right. A little bit of history here. So local search goes back to Newton, at least, and neural nets were invented by Turing. The first genetic algorithms actually goes back to 1962, and the person who invented it tested it on linear programs. Didn't work anywhere as well as the simplex method, but that's what he tested on. Yeah.
So you've been mentioning a lot how these genetic algorithms often don't perform as well as these IPs, LPs. But what are your thoughts on using these problems? Like where I've seen them take off a lot are things in vehicle routing problems with tough constraints where these IPs
Just die, yeah. Right. So again, it's like with those tough scheduling problems with the job shops. If you use the genetic algorithm to not choose the solution itself, but you're using the genetic algorithm to choose, say, weights. Okay, and you use those weights as part of a heuristic that's designed to generate a feasible solution. It's like doing list processing in scheduling. You would be just changing your permutation. What job has a higher priority over which, but you've tied it to a heuristic that's designed to get feasible solutions. And genetic algorithms work actually remarkably well, and I don't think we understand mathematically why. I think it's one of the things we should do research into. How much time do I have? 12:26. Okay, so I have to point this out, that one of the very early pieces of work was very successful. This is Rechenberg and Schwaffel. And what they did was they were optimizing shapes for wind tunnel performance. And they were searching in a parameter space. They did not do their search on the actual shape. They had a set of parameters to generate shapes, and this is from the early work, mostly forgotten, and it's a pity because it's only been discovered much more recently how powerful this method is. No, I guess I'd better skip over most of this. I just do want to mention that the Lynn Kernighan heuristic for the traveling salesman problem is used by a lot of NIAs, because if you just use the NIA by itself, it doesn't get anywhere. So they layer a little NIA on top of the Lynn Kernighan heuristic, and then they report that they have really good results.
At least as good as Lynn Kernighan.
Yeah. Okay. This is just a list of some of the cool names of recent NIAs, like intelligent water drops, roach infestation, krill herds, but they don't herd, sperm motility, fireflies, wolf packs, slime molds. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. I do want to say there have been some successes. Okay, this is a description of the algorithm that Sunil Nakrani and I used, which imitates the way honeybees allocate the foragers amongst flower patches, and it worked really, really well to allocate servers in an internet hosting center. And I don't have time to describe the homology here, but you can find our papers and we describe it. But the point is that the matching between the two problems was just amazing. It was very, very strong. I mean, these were really, really similar problems. They weren't just superficially similar, like, oh, we have to allocate. The level of the homology went really deep. And I think that's why it was effective. Kevin Piscino has used imitations of what bacteria do to climb a noisy gradient. Mosquitoes do this too, right? So how does a mosquito find you? It's mostly your carbon dioxide, it's a little bit your heat, okay? But what they're doing is they're moving towards where there's a higher concentration of CO2. The bacteria move to where there's a higher concentration of nutrients. But there's a little noise there. It's not a perfectly regular gradient. But if you have multiple bacteria and they're getting information from each other, then the noise of the gradient averages out, and they really do see what direction to go in to find a higher concentration. And that's a cool idea. The idea that you have a population and that you can use the average of what the population observes to smooth out noise. That's, I think, a powerful nature-inspired idea. I did some work to play StarCraft autonomously, and we, again, were successful in imitating one of the things that honeybee colonies do. But this is a slide I showed at that American Association for the Advancement of Science talk. And this shocked people, right? That in '97, say, the nature-inspired heuristics could sometimes find an optimal solution for 50 cities, whereas, in 1994, we have, this, more than 7,000 point PLA solved to provable optimality. Well, heck, the famous paper by Danzig and Johnson, right, where they found the optimal solution to 49 cities. Okay, that's a lot earlier than 1997, and it was proved optimal. I mean, this is the gap between what OR does and what these heuristics do is crazy. Shortest path, you can imitate what ants do to find the shortest path, and you'll be, a million times or a billion times slower, and not certain to be optimal if you compare it with algorithms that are standard for us. Jim, I haven't checked to see if there's a nature-inspired max flow, but I'm sure that your algorithm crushes it. This is slime mold. This was a big deal in the community, okay, right? This is I think it was published in Nature. And what do? The slime mold is a single-celled organism, but it's big, and you put nutrients out, and after a while, you get something that's not a bad spanning tree. Okay, but you have to understand that people are actually proposing that we design subway systems, using slime mold, as if there's no other way to solve a minimum spanning tree problem. I'm serious. I mean, it's okay. So.
When I said I was very impressed with the slime mold, but not so impressed with the people proposing that be used.
Right. Just a couple more quick things. There's a theorem called the no free lunch theorem, and it is the most trivial thing. Okay? It says that if you have an absolutely arbitrary function, and the only way to get information is by an oracle call, then basically it doesn't matter how you choose the next x to query, because there's no relationship between the function value of one x and the function value of another point in the solution space, right? It's not as though you have, if you change one bit of x, the function value is likely to change only a little bit. The function's totally arbitrary.
So it's independent of every single point.
Yes, everything's independent. So, okay. Right, okay. So this is mathematically the most trivial theorem, and yet it sent shock waves through the NIA community. Okay? Because, why? Because they use the function as, they use it as a black box, and they thought they were doing something powerful and doing really effective optimization, and then they suddenly find out that if you really think of the function as being completely arbitrary, that, well, then there's nothing to work with. Okay? So, just looking at the first few pages on the web of applications of NIAs, this huge set of applications. Okay, I mean, just look, skull prothesis modeling, text clustering, fashion design. Okay, this stuff is being used for so many applications. And that's partly because we vacated that space. We don't do a whole lot of work in nonlinear, non-convex optimization because it's not mathematically pretty. Okay? And so guess who's wandered into that space and made a home there? Right? In the tutorial, I list a bunch of research problems which I think OR people would find interesting and we'd be good at solving. And they're important questions about NIAs. One of them is exactly, can we prove something about the quality of the solutions we get when we use this idea of searching in parameter space? There's no theory known about it. There's no explanation now mathematically for why that's effective. But there might be. And if we understand it better, we might be able to do even better. Okay. As far as sex goes, why should 2 genders be optimal? Maybe 7 are better, 3 is better. That's the kind of thing actually we could study and make some headway with. Okay. I listed a bunch of other ones in the tutorial. I think this is another interesting one, is that there might be a relationship between smooth analysis and searching in problem space. That's something I haven't had a chance to think about much, but it might turn out there's something profound there. So I think that's worth looking at. Anyway, so my final message is that we need to wake up and face this and deal with this, because we have good scholarly and intellectual standards. And if we study NIAs carefully, we'll probably learn more about them than the people who are doing them, using them now know. And hopefully, we'll be able to create some tools that have some of the best of both worlds, okay? That reduce that time from when somebody knows they have a problem to the time they have a decent solution to it, but has, but a tool that gives better quality solutions and doesn't require as much tuning or has some actual quality guarantees. The things that NIAs now don't offer. So, but one way or the other, we've got to do a better job informing the scientific and engineering communities and industry that we do some of these things an awful lot better than the NIA community does. And again, if we don't do something about this, we're going to become irrelevant, even though we shouldn't be irrelevant. So that's my main message, is we have to wake up and deal with this. Okay, so thanks for staying with me.